internet meme which I've written out on my own copy of the book, and I'll read it out to you because this is quite good. This is an internet meme. It shows a circle of stages. It's called the circle of diversity. So part one is, we demand to be included in your space to make it more diverse and inclusive. Part two, we demand you change this space to our liking and ban stuff that offends us.
Yeah.
Part three, we demand you be kicked out of this space we created since you offended us. Part four, lol, if you hate us so much, why don't you make your own space? And return to stage one.
Stitch this, mate.
So for the uninitiated, Entryism is the practice of a group of individuals sharing common political goals and beliefs, covertly entering an organisation with the express intention of influencing, controlling, or even destroying it from within. It's a tactic most commonly associated with politics, and I guess recent examples would be the Jeremy Corbyn-led Momentum movement within the UK Labour Party, or Trump's MAGA movement within the Republican Party.
Together, we will make America great again.
The artist, author and cultural commentator Alexander Adams has studied the phenomenon of identitarian entryism in culture for over a decade, and in 2019 published his extremely insightful analysis on the matter entitled Culture War, Art, Identity Politics and Cultural Entryism. Alexander Adams is a British artist and writer. He studied fine art and history of art at Goldsmith College, London. He was the recipient of the 2018 Artist Scholarship from the Francis Bacon Art Foundation, and his art has been exhibited worldwide and added to a number of notable collections, including those of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Welsh National Museum and the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. In Culture Wars, Adams considers the many ways that social justice movements have influenced cultural productions and exposes connections between seemingly unrelated events and trends in both high and popular art. From fine art to superhero comics, from political cartoons to museum policy and practice, there are always certain consistent and persistent inevitabilities when the space invaders appear. As one reviewer put it, Alexander Adams's culture war will stiffen the fibres of those not yet conditioned to capitulate at the sight of each successive wave of self-advancing cultural grievance mongering. For all others, this courageous young scholar's compilation of eviscerating essays will have arrived, sadly, all too late. The following presentation will quote heavily from his chapter on cultural entryism, and Alexander has very kindly agreed to join us to discuss how the various stages or signifiers of entryism that he has identified apply to the identitarian invasion of Doctor Who. And hopefully by the time it's over, you will have a clearer understanding as to why, at least in my humble subjective opinion, Doctor Who 2005 is now plain and simply fucked up beyond all repair.
Sad, really, isn't it? People spend all their time making nice things and other people come along and break them.
In part one, I considered a curious and little-known conspiracy theory concerning a collective of screenwriters called the Doctor Who Feminist Front, who are alleged to have sought out and weaponised sexual abuse allegations against BBC personnel with the specific intention of forcing the corporation to transform Doctor Who into a propaganda vehicle for intersectional feminism. If true, it would be a deeply troubling development, although it would at least go some significant way to explaining how a childhood fanboy of a much-loved Time Lord ultimately came to treat him with quite so much contempt. Crucially, however, for the purpose of this analysis, it doesn't really matter, because in reality, ideological invasions don't generally require the hidden hand of any sort of sapphic sisterhood, and often simply develop organically over time as increasing numbers of individuals with influence and similar political beliefs begin to enter particular industries or cultural space. Indeed, two of Alexander Adams's key stages or signifiers of cultural entryism are that identitarians tend not to engage in especially coordinated campaigns, and that cultural change tends to be achieved by a multitude of small acts carried out by individual activists who happen to share similar views. Those inside an industry will tend to hire others with similar outlooks and thus amplify the influence of their ideas, and will also push for diversity hiring practices focused primarily on the perceived merits of a candidate's immutable personal characteristics above all else. Meanwhile, activists outside of the production push for change in a variety of ways, most notably on social media, where demands are made for more representation or inclusivity, or to make certain real or perceived attitudes taboo. Such demands often appear small or paltry in nature, but they are also never-ending, and their degree of escalation tend to closely mirror the degree to which programme makers are prepared to acquiesce. Such small encroachments are often difficult to oppose, as opposition can appear petty or uncaring, or worse still, condemned as bigoted and ignorant. In the social media era, individuals or institutions are now faced with the constant threat of reputational damage, and ultimately, seemingly insignificant cynical seeding can simply wear down or remove opposition to the demands of activism over time.
Meet Jane. See Jane? She is half the world's population. She has important things to say, and she can be anything she wants to be. But to empower girls, we need to see Jane. If she can see it, she can be it.
I think the thing is that most people who are conservative or in the centre, or just basically they're not authoritarian by outlook, they look at these culture wars and they think, well, you know, this is absurd. I mean, and they tend to give a little bit of ground and they say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if the Doctor Who's female, or it doesn't matter if everyone in the TARDIS is female, or it doesn't matter if all the 50% of all the directors have to be female, or it doesn't matter if 20% have to be black, or 15% have to be disabled, or whatever. And it's like every time you're conceding a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And all of this time you're conceding more and more power to activists and lobbyists. And because you're a normal person, you're getting on with your normal life. You're not obsessing about this. You're not part of a Facebook group which is analysing and pressuring and drumming up petitions and sending out tweets and constantly scouring people's their social media history and so forth. Yeah. So this is why you get activists are just waiting for an opportunity to strike, and they're always ready and they're always looking. And the majority of us are just getting on with our lives, and we're enjoying this, and we're watching this program, and then we're forgetting about it, or we're not paying attention. But activists, small groups of activists, are paying attention all the time, and they are ready to strike as soon as they see a weak point. Yeah. And once they make the claim, once they pounce, of course, we're just saying, oh, well, we're not going to die on that hill. It's just, it's just that particular show. It's just that particular book. Oh, they want to change that name. Oh, it doesn't matter that much. But this is how you get encroachment from every area, because you're living your life, you're being normal, and these activists have all got their special interests, and as soon as they see the chance, they will take a little bit more ground, and in the end, you're left with no ground at all.
Why have we never had a black Doctor Who? They would rather have a dog do Doctor Who than a black person.
When preparing this presentation, I made the conscious decision not to bother with the usual caveats and acts of virtue signalling that decent-minded people generally feel compelled to indulge in when discussing potentially negative outcomes arising from seemingly noble activities such as the pursuit of equality, social justice, and parity of esteem. This began as a practicality arising from runtime, but it also occurs to me that there really is nothing I can possibly say to dissuade any Identarians who may be watching from the belief that any criticism I may have concerning female doctors must consciously or unconsciously be motivated by male fragility, man-baby misogyny, or an irrational fear of people who transition their sex. Adams argues that identitarians are possessed of such absolute moral certainty that they will dismiss any opposition to their position as wrong, ill-informed, hateful, or arguing in bad faith. Furthermore, any opposition to social justice activism is nothing less than the defence and perpetration of an unjust system which must be destroyed, or at the very least radically changed. And as we'll consider later, such moral certainty can inevitably lead to degrees of moral flexibility that would have my doctor turning in his grave. But before we get into all that, let's take a closer look at the sort of simple but cynical seeding that can wear down your opposition over time.
I could bring down your government with a single word.
You're the most remarkable man I've ever met. But I don't think you're quite capable of that.
No, you're right. Not a single word. Just 6.
I don't think so.
6 words.
Stop it!
6.
Is Doctor Who a bit sexist?
Perhaps the most effective identitarian tactic is the perennial pursuit of a question that, at least to some degree, will always invite the answer yes. So let's consider an especially effective example of this strategy that took place in the years leading up to the eventual demise of the world's favourite Time Lord. In 2014, a group of 4 undergrads from Brigham Young University in Idaho, America, collaborated on a project for their media research methods class, posing the succinct moral question, is Doctor Who sexist? As their methodology establishes, the study was inspired by criticism that had arisen during Stephen Moffat's time in charge of the show, and most specifically, perceptions around his attitude towards and portrayal of women and girls. Media coverage of such criticism had escalated the previous year when Moffat's decision to cast Peter Capaldi, or another white dude, in the role of the 12th Doctor, resulted in inevitable accusations of misogyny and even at least one public call for his head. The students presented their findings in a colourful infographic explaining how the answer to their question was indeed a resounding yes, at least based on their direct comparison between Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davis's respective tenures in charge of Doctor Who, and most specifically their mutual ability or otherwise to oversee stories that pass a measurement of female representation in film called the Bechdel test. A few fans quietly questioned the students' own ability to accurately apply their own methods, and the odd or otherwise omission of Matt Smith-era episodes that would have significantly changed the results.
Quite frankly, that was offensive.
But nevertheless, plenty of identitarian-inclined journalists quickly seized upon the study as cold hard evidence of something they were delighted to find, and even forced a response from the head of BBC Drama, who was obliged to publicly defend her showrunner from yet more accusations of systemic isms.
Aren't all ladies made of glass in a way? Very good, sir, very good.
Are we now?
Of course, people will sometimes see exactly what they want to see, and for example, one could argue that Stephen Moffat was at least a more subtle advocate for sex discrimination than he was for spousal abuse. But while it's impossible to measure exactly how much impact such external pressures have on the inner workings of a high-profile production, it inevitably will have some. As well as an overall drop in quality over the Capaldi era, there were certainly signs that some of the scripts that followed were, shall we say, attempting to overcompensate for something.
Is the future going to be all girl? I can only hope.
The next major character introduced just happened to be a Bechdel-busting black lesbian.
Oh, my dear, I hope it doesn't offend you to know that I have some experience of the fairer sex.
Me too.
Good Lord.
And at the time of his departure, Moffat and his defenders were keen to stress that he had done more than anyone in the show's 55-plus year history to pave the way for what came next.
Can I just say that it was Stephen who really laid the ground for this gender transformation. We have an evil character called the Master, who he transformed into Missy the Mistress, played beautifully by Michelle Gomez. So the idea of a gender switch really comes from Stephen.
By the time that the critics demanding that the next Doctor must be female eventually got their wish, the transgender transition of a world-famous Time Lord was perhaps all but inevitable, not least given the ideological and identity politics-infused invasions that had swept through science fiction over Moffat's time in charge.
I'm not surprised that they went for Doctor Who itself, because the bigger the prize, the more... because they see things in strategic terms, because if you've been schooled in Marxism, you see everything as a power play between different groups. If you're schooled in feminism, fourth wave feminism, you're thinking of culture and representation as a battleground. If you're a postmodernist, you understand, you see the world as controlled by language. And if you're involved in the nerd culture, then of course it doesn't matter that a program may be aimed at adolescents or at children. This is still something that you keep obsessively watching and monitoring as you enter adulthood. So I'm not surprised that they wanted Doctor Who.
No, that's not a good idea.
Well done. The Doctor has walked in blood through all of time and space. The Doctor has many names. The Imp of the Pandorica, the Shadow of the Barnyard, the Beast of Trenzalore, the Butcher of Skull Moon, the Last Tree of Barcelona, the Destroyer of Skaro. He is the Doctor of War.
What was that?
To be fair, they cut out all the jokes.
Identarians view culture as an expression of the power dynamics between the privileged and oppressed.
If I hear any more language like that from you, young lady, you're in for a jolly good smack bottom.
A few days before The Guardian sought comment on fresh claims of misogyny, Stephen Moffat had faced down his critics at the Hay Festival, insisting that the show should resist all political efforts to cast a female Doctor, stating that casting is the dark arts of television. It is everything. That decision is central and absolute to everything you do. It's the difference between a television programme and a sensation. So you don't mess around with that. You don't cast for any other reason than for passion and for aesthetics. It's not a political decision, it's an aesthetic decision, and always will be. Chris Chibnall maintains that his casting decisions have equally been a matter of aesthetics, and yet much of the early marketing and promotion for his new Doctor did have a noticeably political edge. Like most Who fans, I was of course prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt, but from day one, not entirely subtle signifiers about the show's direction pointed to something else.
What is wonderful is this realisation that a woman can be a doctor. And, you know, I may be playing an alien with two hearts, but I am qualified even though I'm a woman. That's always the bit.
Adams proposes that from an identitarian perspective, aesthetics are like a parlour game played by the elite of a dominant class. They're nothing more than a bourgeois indulgence, enforcing cultural convention upon unwilling and excluded groups. Identarians see culture as a battlefield to wage warfare against the groups they perceive as powerful and oppressive.
What? Attention! Listen! Aim!
So I think there is space in the fandom for an expansion of Doctor Who, including a lead female character. But obviously that's not the prize. Obviously the prize is being Doctor Who, so you get that representation, and it's to do with capturing. It's not to do with representation, it's to do with capturing the cultural capital of the group that you see as your opponents. Yeah. It's to do with capturing it, demeaning it, altering it in canon, and then replacing the head with your representation. So it's a symbolic way of capturing the flag.
Consequently, the only two aspects that matter to them in culture are the demographics of the producers and consumers of art, and the propagandist and politically useful content of the product itself. Such a perspective is derived from Marxism, but class or socioeconomic status have been replaced by other demographics such as skin colour, sexual orientation, and sex. Such perspective downplays individual agency in favour of seeing individuals as merely members of a group or protected class who act consciously or otherwise to further the interests of the group as a whole. And in such context, it struck me as telling that the BBC chose to schedule the unveiling of the very first female doctor immediately following the men's Wimbledon tennis final, when the Saturday evening women's final might have appeared to be a more obvious and celebratory choice.
And it's typically British, and it's typically macho, and it's very long running, and it's world famous. So of course that is another ultimate prize, because if you can deprive men of their fantasy figure, their fantasy role model, then of course you've got a victory. You've taken something away from them. Because it's not that you want to do something, it's not that you want to be creative in an area, it's that you want to prevent your opponent from having the thing that he loves. And the very fact that people love it, that's why it is a target.
Another signifier worth mentioning in that context is the fact that Identarians will always attempt to control discussions about culture.
Fantastic Jodie Whittaker became the first ever female Doctor Who.
And I think that one thing that you get with these sort of woke fandoms, especially when they get a foothold in the actual production teams, you see this especially to do with cartoons. And drama serials, especially American ones, that any mild reasoned criticism of a story or an actor or a casting choice or the injection of politics from a simple point of view, well, I don't think that's appropriate for this story, or, you know, I kind of agree with your politics, but I don't really want to see it in this program and so forth. Anyone putting that forward is liable to be charged with, they're not literally charged in Britain, although it could be on the way, but they're liable to get back from the production team, from the creators, oh, this is harassment. So criticism is framed as harassment. So then what happens is the production team can say, oh, look, we did something brave and bold and following our convictions, and we received abuse and trolling and aggression and viciousness. Therefore, they can say to the bosses, who are perhaps not paying very much attention, they're not being granular, they're not actually looking at the list of tweets, they're not looking at what the fans are saying on the fan sides. What they're doing is they're hearing from their production team and from the favourable pieces written by journalists, oh, our production team has been attacked by far right-wing hate groups, so therefore we must keep them on. They're losing money, they're losing ratings, it's a terrible show, but we've got to keep them on because we've got to prevent the trolls, the vicious man babies, the misogynists from scoring a victory. So this is how the production team and the woke fandom managed to protect their property from reasoned criticism and also from losing their funding.
Cultural entryists will use positions in the traditional and online media to shape and control reactions. They will lobby for the moderators of internet forums to suppress dissent, and will also seek to misrepresent those who dare speak out. An obvious example of these tactics unfolded within 24 hours of Jodie Whittaker's unveiling, when numerous media sources began reporting grossly exaggerated claims of a backlash from fans on social media, exaggerated claims widely repeated as fact.
Much controversy followed, of course, because apparently some fans of space travel in a phone box, sonic screwdrivers and intergalactic alien races found it difficult to imagine that.
And I think what's more wonderful is, despite a lot of people in the press claiming there's been some big backlash among Doctor Who fans. There hasn't. There has been no backlash except for one horrible spotty fat man in his basement typing.
And I apologize for that already, so get off my back.
In fairness, it would also be an exaggeration to say that there were no dissenters at all. But I remember at the time being struck by just how little grumbling about a female Doctor there actually was, certainly on Twitter and various Doctor Who forum sites that I kept an eye on over the following week. So much so that I suspect this may in fact have been evidence of yet another signifier at play, namely that Identarians will institute a purity test for producers and consumers, and woe betide those who fail.
I'm going to say 90% of people who have a problem with a female Doctor Who also have a problem with female doctors generally.
Participants in cultural production will be judged in moral terms and expected to prove their loyalty to their identitarian ideology through their work, private life and personal associations. Consumers will be judged likewise. If consumers criticise the product, then it is they who have failed, not the product that has disappointed them. Such rules even apply to former Doctor Who's, as Peter Davison quickly found out when he stepped ever so slightly outside of the party line. So is it any wonder that so few people were prepared to put their head above the parapets and so much as lament the loss of a moral and valued role model for young boys? To do so was essentially to be dismissed as sexist, mocked as a man-baby, and quite possibly even publicly shamed by the new Doctor Who herself.
Look, if all of this really just boils down to you being uncomfortable with a woman being in a position of power, here's a tip. Why don't you lock yourself in a shed, build yourself a time machine and fuck off back to 1950?
Identarians within cultural production will devise and implement quota programming.
It wasn't as big as it was made out to be. It was like a thing where I was like, I'm here, you know, it's a production in association with my company. I'm here leading the show. This is not how it should be.
This will include quota programming, representation casting, equity hires, and other methods of altering the composition of organisations, cultural products, and consumption of culture. Such actions will first be covert. Later, if quotas are not ruled illegal, opposed from within an industry, or found to be publicly unacceptable, the quotas will become overt and tolerated or even officially sanctioned.
The vast majority of all people, not just in a fan base, but I think everyone thinks if someone has enough merit and they have the interest and they have the skill, then they should be able to do the job, regardless of their colour or their sexuality or their religion or whatever. I think everyone's behind that. I think the problem is that once you start promoting people due to their demographic characteristics, the problem is that you have people who are promoted above their competency because they are chosen to fulfill certain roles, not because of their merits. Now, of course, there will be skillful people who are in those groups, but they're not necessarily the ones who are going to get promoted.
There can be little doubt that quota programming had shifted into overdrive at the start of the Chibnall era, when Whittaker's Doctor essentially became the poster girl for a corporation-wide diversity drive involving specific representation targets, both on-screen and off. Such practices have by now become widespread in television and film productions, and I'd point to a recent revelation about goings-on behind the screen to highlight just how tolerated diversity hire practices have become over the time since Doctor Who returned to our screens. When Russell T Davies oversaw the successful reboot in 2005, he introduced the concept of non-traditional, integrated or blind casting practices to the world of Doctor Who. This is the practice of casting parts without first considering the actor's ethnicity, skin colour, body shape or sex. And it has become something of an industry standard, leading to productions where historical figures or characters from classic literature are portrayed by actors from different backgrounds to the source.
This is a huge sort of challenging big role, and you can't help but feel the sense of that, I guess, Beverly, at this stage, because there's history involved here.
Yeah, I mean, this is a woman who is an icon for feminism, for politics, global politics, not just here in Britain. and is so important in the story of world history.
There were a few people saying that this part shouldn't have been yours.
Yes.
What is that all about? There's tweets or various things, I guess, which happens regardless anyway, doesn't it? Let's face it.
You're just not going to please everyone, are you? Chill.
Actor Noel Clarke may have participated in such a process when auditioning for the part of Mickey Smith in season 1. However, it is also possible that by the time his part was being cast, the production team may have been specifically looking for a black actor to play the role of Billie Piper's earthbound boyfriend. I've explored both practices in detail in a previous video, and crucially, while both are legal, the latter route would have involved discrimination on grounds of both sex and race, and therefore it would have had to rely on a very narrow exception allowed under the Equality Act, where specific protected characteristics are viewed as essential to the role. So for example, presumably the BBC invoked such a qualification when casting an actress to play the historical figure Rosa Parks in 2019, rather than have rolled the dice with their by then long established non-traditional approach. Noel Clarke was the first black and second only ever actor from a minority ethnic background to be cast as a companion in the show, and while I'd suggested artistically his subsequent trajectory has been more Danny Dyer than, say, Denzel Washington, until very recently Clarke had managed to carve out a long and successful career for himself, both in front of and behind the camera. By the way, allegations about his alleged abusive behaviour dropped at a very late stage in the production of this video, and consequently I don't think it's fair for me to rush to judgment until proper investigations are complete. That said, the two observations I will make are that Noel Clarke certainly didn't speak out when the cancel mob came for Stephen Finn, more of which in a minute, and that Identarians do often turn out to be much better at talking the talk than they are at walking the walk.
For the record, any men out there, do not try that at work. You will be fired and possibly go to jail.
Anyway, in 2009, Clarke beat Michael Fassbender to the BAFTA Rising Star Award, and his name was recently added to a prestigious and extremely exclusive list of luminaries, including Kenneth Branagh, Ridley Scott, and John Hurt, when he became one of the youngest, albeit possibly briefest, recipients of the prestigious BAFTA Award for outstanding British contribution to cinema. So I guess my point is that he can hardly be described as an industry outsider.
My journey in this business has been a battle at times. And as I stand here right now, I know a lot of the work I've done is not BAFTA worthy. But I think this is about the journey. It's about the times maybe it was worthy and not recognized. I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm not here without the people before me. And hopefully people see that I've tried to elicit change in the industry. So this is for the underrepresented. Anyone who sits at home believing that they can achieve more. This is particularly for my young black boys and girls out there who never believed that this could happen to them. Sometimes you'll feel like it's not achievable. It is. Sometimes you'll feel like you're not good enough. You are. And sometimes you'll feel like you don't deserve it. You do.
Clarke has often spoke out about racism, something which he has described as embedded within the fabric of British society and the UK film industry as a whole. And during a talk to the Edinburgh Television Festival in 2020, he offered a surprisingly frank example, which in some ways certainly support such claims. He spoke about joining a recently unnamed production in the north of England, widely assumed to be Tiger Aspect's ITV police drama Viewpoint, and immediately demanding that the producers replace the film crew, who were entirely white, stating that I'm on a job which I can't mention, and I came in one day and I'm the lead actor, and I was like, the crew's not diverse enough. Fix it. Fix it. They said, yeah, but I said, I don't want to hear anything else. Fix it.
Look, you have to understand, right? We're shooting up north, which is already slightly difficult. Then also there was Corona, right? So, you know, pickings were limited, right? I come onto set and I look around and I'm there. It probably wasn't day one. It's probably like day two. And I'm like, this is not enough. And I spoke to people and they said, yeah, fine, you're right. We'll do something about it. And, you know, it was a thing, well, you know, Corona just happened, this, that, and the other. but we'll get on it.
Aside from the potential impact on production quality, such diva-ish demands certainly appear to describe an act of direct race discrimination that has been illegal in the UK since Clarke was 1 year old. Noel Clarke subsequently claimed that no one lost their job over the incident, but when a fellow director disputed this, that's exactly what happened to him. ITV fired Stephen Finn from Coronation Street after he described Clarke as an arrogant fucktard on social media, and suggested that given the tightness of television budgets, some people on freelance contracts would have been let go to assuage his agenda. And speaking of agendas,
In your time, humanity's busy arguing over the washing up while the house burns down. Unless people face facts and change, catastrophe is coming. People can save planets or wreck them. That's the choice. Be the best of humanity. Or, how dare you?
Identarians will produce culture that furthers their political agenda rather than the expectations of consumers or the developments of the cultural form. They will produce content to suit themselves, not the consumer. It is the content the producer believes the audience should consume, regardless of what they may necessarily want. And part of a political agenda concerned with pulverizing patriarchies will inevitably lead to a not insignificant change in tone.
And also, you've got to remember the emotional impetus behind them. They want to demean and humiliate not only the character, the principal character, but they want to do that to the audience. They're extremely antagonistic towards the audience.
Yeah.
So what they can do is if they can capture a property, get a main character, get their writers in there, then they can get the main character to berate the audience, to get the main character to tell the audience that they've always been sexist, that they've always been racist, that they've always been xenophobic, and that they have to do the work, as they put it. And this is a way of proving that they have the high ground, that they have secured this position, and they are using this in order to demonstrate that they have control of the narrative, they have control of the property, they have control of the resources. So it's not so much what they want to do with them, it's more that the fact that they have taken them away from the people they perceive as their opponents. And obviously for feminists, they tend to see things in binary, so they tend to position this as a battle between men and women. Then what you can do is, if you have this mindset of us versus them, good versus evil, and you stop particularizing, you collectivize everything, what happens is then you can take an example, you can take one man and you can accuse him of harassing, of abusing, of raping, which is supposedly what's happened in this case in the Doctor Who production team. And then if you pinpoint him and you can smear him, and these smears actually effectively destroy this person's character and their career and so forth, then you've gained another target. But also, it doesn't matter if those allegations are true or not, because this man is adjacent to another man, and if the first man hasn't done something, then the second one probably has. And if not, then they are part of a group which has benefited systemically from oppression and violence and harassment and rape. So if you can do one thing to humiliate one person in this group, you have scored a victory against the whole group. And that's especially true when it comes to cultural products, which are typically seen as the capital of your opponents. So a male role model like James Bond or Doctor Who is an ideal way of expressing of showing that you will gain revenge for the crimes that your opponents have committed against your group.
The sixth face of delusion is the wearer's own. That was probably the idea, don't you think?
Identarian propaganda, quota programming and diversity hiring will be noticed by consumers and will generate resistance.
Chibs and his incompetent diversity hires took over the show with the blessing of the diversity hires that run the BBC, with the intent to make the most condescending and unpleasant viewing experience known to man.
Close your eyes, dear viewer, and imagine a teddy bear. A delightful, fluffy little chap that you've had for as long as you can remember. When you were a little kid, you'd contentedly fall asleep holding it, and it would be the first thing you saw when you woke up each morning. It was comforting and fun, and it was always there whenever you needed it. Then, as time passed and you grew older, you began to need the bear less and less, but you could never quite bring yourself to throw it away, because every time you saw it, it brought a fond smile to your face, reminding you of the simple innocence of childhood. And you knew that one day, you'll pass that bear on to your own children, so a whole new generation can make their own happy memories with it. What a charming thought. Now imagine that some fat middle-aged dickhead comes along, spray paints political slogans all over your bear, telling you that you're a horrible person, rips the head off, and replaces it with an 18-inch black rubber dildo.
When it becomes clear to consumers that political motivations trump artistic ones, general consumers will react negatively. There will be resistance towards the agenda of the creators.
Agenda is much more important than narrative and storytelling, and the fans must be disposable.
They will criticize the product and boycott it.
There's an almost tangible sense of hostility and mean-spiritedness hanging around this show now, like it kind of knows that people hate it, and it's just sticking around as long as possible to spite them. But go it must, because most of its audience already has. And to be honest, I'm one of them.
And there will be attendant cynicism where all newly prominent members of protected classes in a field of production will be seen, fairly or unfairly, as beneficiaries of political motivated casting, quotas and hiring.
Scripts were written by people with little to no talent, but at least they had the right ideology and ticked the right quota boxes. Directors were brought in with very little talent. Everyone behind the scenes were also only there because they ticked the right boxes, while the old crew, many of which had been with the show since it came back, were summarily dismissed because they were too white and or too male.
This has the ugly side effect of stigmatizing competent individuals from minorities who have earned their professional status through merit. Thus, one of the outcomes of forced diversity is hostility not only to identitarian creators, but politically neutral and competent members of minorities in the arts.
And this leads to a terrible situation where people just look, they look at, for example, in my area, in fine art, you just look at a name on a listing of new exhibitions that are around town, and you see, an African name, and you just think, oh, your stomach drops a bit. Oh no, because you've seen so many bad artists who are sort of worthy, who are chosen because of their skin color or because of their politics. And this might be a fantastic African artist. This might be a brilliant one who's been promoted on merit and has done something amazing that you would love. But you just look at the name and you think, oh, I've been burnt once or twice too many times for that.
Identarians will become frustrated at their inability to control culture.
I mean, is it me? Am I doing this wrong? Am I just not getting this show? Trying to review Doctor Who these days is like flirting with some kind of existential crisis. Like I'll tumble off into madness if I think about it too long.
Creators who are hired by identitarians based on demographic traits can be unsuited for the positions they are given because the criteria for hiring them are demographic traits rather than ability and experience in the field. To the identarian employer, the latter factors are either of little or no importance compared to the greater benefits derived of virtue signalling due to hiring a candidate from a protected class. I think it would be unfair to suggest that Jodie Whittaker's casting came purely down to an acceptable anatomy, but her protected class and position as the first ever female doctor will almost certainly have helped to deflect criticism away from what many fans view to have been an underwhelming and poorly researched portrayal of a transgender timeless child of alien origin with an extraordinarily rich and complex heritage.
I mean, to me, it was just like, it's a guy.
But I mean, did you feel the pressure to kind of
homework,
do your research?
So I'd only seen a few eps
right
previous because I'd one brought up with it. So then I started to watch a bit during my audition process, and I quickly decided that was not the way for me.
Was that not helpful?
Not at all.
If the rumours are true, then Whittaker will be leaving the production at the end of the year after a truncated final season, possibly even because the programme's declining audience appreciation index figures now risk the role causing her career trajectory more actual harm than good. Time will tell as to how she is ultimately remembered, but presumably the popular narrative may well be that Doctor Who fans just weren't quite ready for Jodie Whittaker, more so than Jodie Whittaker just wasn't quite right or ready for Doctor Who.
Ideally, Doctor Who would have been split into 2 series. So you have had the main series with Doctor Who, which would carried on with a male actor of whatever colour, and then you would have had a parallel series which would have been of a female Time Lord, and then this would be a set, and you could alternate between them, so you could have the 2 series running at the same time. I think the only problem with that is that, as I said, activists wanted to capture the A series, the big title, and then also you'd have the problem whereas you'd have the ratings, you'd have a ratings comparison, and of course the largely apolitical, largely canonical, the largely sort of main character-driven version, the primary one, would do extremely well, and then the woke, feminist representation one would do very badly, and there would be a disparity, and that this would be seen as unacceptable because it would be sort of, due to the BBC sabotaging the woman or not providing enough resources or so forth. So I think even if you did do a smart thing, which would be to put forward the 2 to provide more rather than to take away, so to add rather than subtract, I think that ultimately that would probably get sabotaged by the left anyway. I don't think they would allow a successful male A series to continue.
Because if a protected class creator fails in terms of competence or appeal, this will be portrayed as the outcome of systemic bias and social bigotry. And indeed, any such failure will simply reinforce the Identarian victim narrative of social marginalisation. Meanwhile, any notable successes, such as the significant praise for Joe Martin's more commanding performance as the Doctor, will not undermine the victim narrative. Failure is proof of the overwhelming bigotry in society. Success is simply an exception earned in the face of great opposition. Nonetheless, Identarians will blame the failure of diversity hire creators on social bias, not personal inadequacy.
And everyone's getting angry and shouting at each other, but nobody's really listening to what's being said. Something which used to represent innocent, universal fun has become a battleground for everyone's petty hang-ups, grievances and insecurities.
Culture derives its power through consensus and consumption by multiple individuals over prolonged periods of time, all of which leads to the development of expertise, conventions and canon. These develop through collaborative efforts and are out of the control of any single individual. For example, Russell T Davies is rightly credited for reimagining the Doctor for a 21st century audience, but from the outset it was an extremely complicated and collaborative production, and one signifier of its success is almost certainly the disproportionate proportion of professionals involved who had been fans of the original show.
Born the day after Episode 2 of Colony in Space was transmitted in 1971, David Mcdonald was raised in Paisley, a town just west of Glasgow in Scotland. After seeing Pertwee's finale Planet of the Spiders, he became an ardent Doctor Who fan, tuning in to his hero's escapades with a fervour approaching religious. He only missed a single episode in 9 years, unwillingly dragged away for a family visit, something he couldn't quite forgive his parents for. It was while watching Doctor Who, wrapped in the multicoloured scarf his gran had knitted for him, that it occurred to the young Scot that the stories he was enjoying, the fantastical adventures that transported him weekly, were actually made by someone. This realisation solidified his destiny. He would become an actor, and one day he would become the Doctor.
Do you know what happens if you hold 2 identical sonic devices against each other?
No.
Nor me. Let's find out.
Indeed, the lack of love and respect bias towards everything that came before it is one of the more obvious explanations for Doctor Who 2019's comparative failure. When the open market and undirected cultural production and consumption do not result in sufficient advances of politically suitable culture and successful producers from protected classes, social activists will simply agitate for even more quotas and affirmative action. For the socialist, the solution to the failure of socialism is always more socialism. And the same logic applies to the Identarian. And sadly, for anyone still watching, Doctor Who's future, at least in its current format, is now a fixed point in space and time.
Back to normal, am I? The only time I've been a man, that last body. Dear Lord, how do you cope with all that ego?
Even if they wanted to, it is now impossible for the BBC to turn the Doctor back to normal, and consequently politics must come before aesthetics when it comes to the casting of each subsequent Doctor.
One woman out of 13 random regenerations is not political correctness gone mad. It's the law of probability. I mean, considering every one of those regenerations has also been white, odds are if you don't like Jodie Whittaker, you're going to hate what's coming next.
Yes?
I've never told you this before, but I find you incredibly attractive.
Perry, this is a children's program.
Maybe they'll take it off the air for a while, so we can get to know each other better.
Sounds good to me. Fancy a dance?
And you can weaponize the antagonism. As I said, you can weaponize the antagonism between the fan base and the creative team in order to prove your point. And if something fails commercially or critically, well, it's probably only commercially. If it fails commercially, what this does is it just proves your audience was so racist all along. They would never have accepted your black doctor or your female lead or whatever, or your changes to the canon. They were just so intolerant and unaccepting that they completely rejected this wonderful product. So it's not a question of the product failing the viewers, failing to draw in not only the fans but also normies. It's a question of the fans and the audience failing the creators and the activists.
Failure will lead Identarians to attempt to discredit and destroy their own field of cultural production.
Let's do it together. 1, 2, 3.
Exterminate!
We know the show's creative team is a contradiction in terms. We know the actors either don't give a fuck or don't have any talent to begin with. We know the writers don't understand what made this show good and lack the ability to craft a decent story anyway. But it's the destruction of the show's canon that's the biggest sin here. Not content with ruining Doctor Who by presenting their own unique vision of it in the present, Chris Chibnall and the writing team now seem determined to sink their claws into the show's 57-year legacy as well. I got a real sense that they want to make a lasting mark on the entire Doctor Who franchise, not just the handful of seasons they've been given. Probably because they know they're living on borrowed time and everyone can't wait to get them out the fucking door.
It's because it's to do with taking and occupying the canon, because if you can get in to the canon and you can alter it, then what you can do, as in Doctor Who, you can say, well, you see, canonically speaking, this character was female, or this character was black, or this character was always gay. And once you've done that with the canon, it's sort of like you're leaving your mark on it, you're staining it. I mean, not in a pejorative way, but you're leaving your imprint, and this can never be erased because it's canonical. And of course, for nerds, that really matters, and it really hurts, and they know that hurts. It wouldn't hurt them because they don't really care, but it hurts. But they know that they're hurting people they see as their opponents. And once you've decided it's creators and activists versus the fans, basically it's your job to piss off the fans, to attack the fans, to demean the fans. And if that means ruining and staining and irrevocably altering the property, then that's what you do.
Just like with the dildo teddy bear that's been awkwardly photoshopped into your family albums, you can't even escape from Chibnall's influence by finding solace in past versions of the Doctor now. Whenever you look at William Hartnell playing the very first Doctor, somewhere in the back of your mind, you'll know that people like this came before him. When you think of the mighty Time Lords of Gallifrey now, you'll know that they only came into being because of strong female explorer repeatedly murdering children. And it's just kind of depressing to see the work of so many talented, hard-working people being slowly undone and trampled on by their unworthy successors. People who were chosen for the job because they spouted the correct politics, or fit the correct demographics, or toed the correct line. People who probably wouldn't even be working in the industry if it wasn't for the extremely accommodating hiring practices at the BBC.
Sheer fucking hubris.
The inevitable failure of so-called woke productions will be assumed to be an example of the intolerance and bigotry of consumers. The rejection of identitarian cultural products by consumers on the basis that the products lack nuance, complexity and cultural authenticity will be understood by identitarians as a rejection of their ideological message. If social activism proves impossible or ineffectual in a field or faces effective opposition, then attempts will be made to undermine or discredit the field, which is considered a source of oppression.
It's especially if you're letting in the people who have a vested interest in pushing a particular narrative, who are particularly invested in sort of diversity and inclusion. They're not going to step back, and the point is that, of course, they have no investment. They're not particularly attached to the properties. They're not long-time fans of these. They're not particularly interested in the canon. So once they get in, they see what they're doing as a platform for their views. And it doesn't actually bother them if they damage a property. So when they see the sales of a particular comic book or views of a TV show going down, it doesn't matter to them because they're essentially parasitic, and they will move on to something else. They will essentially burn down a property. They will destroy a canon to make a point, and then when the company goes bust or the show gets cancelled, they simply move on to something else.
For society to enjoy the consumption of morally inferior products, which have outcompeted morally superior product, is insufferable for the activist creator. The creator will therefore attempt to deprive consumers of their morally inferior, pleasurable product. And after The Timeless Child, it seems that this stage of the invasion has been achieved.
I believe that the last 2 seasons of Chris Chibnall's Doctor Who has been a giant middle finger to the fandom, and he wrote that middle finger into this episode. He mocks and patronizes the fans.
Around the time of The Timeless Child's broadcast, the BBC's head of drama claimed that the show had never been in better health editorially, and is a long way from getting the axe. And despite dramatic drops in both ratings and audience approval, I've no doubt that Doctor Who 2019 will stumble on for a while. Nevertheless, for all intents and purposes, the invasion is now irreversible and complete. The pod people, or perhaps alphabet people, have done for Doctor Who and replaced him with a replicant moulded from their mindset. Everyone else can see that the world's favourite egalitarian Time Lord has been transformed into something altogether more alien, even if not everybody feels comfortable saying that out loud. All of which brings us back full circle to the most damning and depressing signifier of them all.
And I've been keeping a very close eye on how, what type of bad press it's been getting from individuals who I think are a little bit, let's just say, maybe not dealing with a full deck of cards, if that makes sense.
Identarians are possessed of absolute moral certainty.
Confused and upset by this, you go online to share your experience with other bear users, and suddenly you've got an avalanche of people who've never even owned a bear screaming at you that bears have always had 18-inch dildos attached to them, so why do you have a problem with it now? This is just the way bears are now, and you need to deal with it. Are you some kind of bear bigot? Are you intimidated by strong independent bears?
Why are you guys getting so much hate? I don't get this. Okay, you might have a take on Doctor Who or whatever that people disagree with, but do they need to make it that personal?
They really do. Listen, I've gotten emails saying horrible things about my kids because I'm, that stuff's and especially with Bowles Trek got something recently that was really horrible. People, we're just criticizing a TV show. That's all
Yep.
it is. Have some perspective on life.
Identarians will view any perceived opposition as nothing less than the defence and perpetration of a system which is unjust and must therefore be destroyed or subject to immediate radical change. Such moral certainty justifies action against dissenters that might ordinarily be considered as entirely immoral or at the very least unkind. And sadly, it's exactly this sort of moral certainty that has led a new breed of Whovians to involve themselves in insidious hate campaigns and personal attacks against others in the fandom for daring to openly discuss the perspective that the Chibnall era has been poorly written and is distractingly PC. This has been especially noticeable on YouTube, where dissent has been harder to shut down. Criticism of recent episodes frequently attract high viewing numbers, and as a consequence, self-appointed moral guardians have viciously attacked dissenters, branding them as bigots or dismissing them as somehow intellectually inferior to themselves.
YouTube has become a place where people can come and talk about that stuff because they haven't been able to. Comment sections were shut down on websites. You're being Facebook, and really the correlation is the same. When Facebook groups started shutting down, and then all of a sudden more and more people came in, and they just needed a place to go and talk about it and vent, and that's it. And then they go about their day. And now we're being conflated into all this other political garbage. And I'm not saying I disagree with some of these politics. It's not politics, it's ideology.
The element of sort of everything being politically charged, it adds that extra like that emotional element to things for people. So you're not just debating a show anymore, you're debating an entire philosophy on the world and life. And you can't have a discussion with a person like that because there's no common ground. There's no kind of common understanding of how you're going to discuss things. It's like you either agree with me or you're wrong.
Dissent from within activist groups will be considered betrayal. Internal purging and clique behaviour lead to the application of a ever-tightening moral circle which excludes those not sufficiently committed or politically incompatible and more closely binds the remaining members left within.
Obviously, there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way, and it's like when someone... all it takes is a few people to kind of bring the subject up, and it kind of opens the floodgates. And I think you should be able to talk about stuff like this. I think it's really sad what you were describing, where people want to have a civilized discussion with you about the problems of Doctor Who, but they feel like they can't do it because they're going to get ostracized by their friends. You know, just for talking to you. It's like, what the fuck have you become? You know, if that's what the fandom is, if that's their attitude, you know, that's bullshit. Like, it's pathetic.
Peter Capaldi closed out the era of the Doctor's 13 life regeneration cycle with the suggestion that one should never be cruel, never be cowardly, laugh hard, run fast, and be kind. And yet, sadly, over subsequent seasons, it has become increasingly clear that not everyone agrees with such typically Whovian advice. Maybe it's just a generational thing, but I doubt it. It feels more like a psychological contract has been broken for much of the audience. It feels like a fundamental shift in values in the hearts of Doctor Who.
Impolite guests get to feel the back of my candy hand!
That may be, Candyman, but the last time we met you said you were going to kill me.
Really, Doctor? Thank you for reminding me.
I'm old enough to remember when the Doctor's television adventures were last in such a state of crisis. Back then, the backroom boys of the BBC were actively trying to do for Doctor Who. This time round, it seems more like they actively want to do for the fan base, or at least anyone in it representing sections of the community who don't necessarily think like them. Maybe it really is just a generational thing, but I doubt it. Maybe Doctor Who has transformed into an entirely different show with an entirely different set of values and goals. And to illustrate this, I want to conclude with a short story concerning the sort of values that I grew up with, and a story that, for me at least, more than anything else, sums up the distance in time and space travelled between some fans of a famous Time Lord and some fans of a timeless child. In 1963, the Reverend Martin Luther King famously addressed the crowds from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. He spoke not only after centuries in which black Americans had been first slaves and then second-class citizens, but in an era when racist laws were still on the statute books in American states, including anti-miscegenation laws allowing courts to punish couples from different racial backgrounds who had fallen in love. King spoke of his dream for a future where his children might one day live in a nation where they would be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. In doing so, he not only appealed to foundations of justice in the founding traditions and principles of America, but also made the single most eloquent defence anyone has ever made about the right way in which to treat other human beings. Fast forward less than 60 years, and as the British author Douglas Murray observes, we find ourselves in a time and space where an insidious current has developed that has chosen to reject Dr. King's dream and instead insist that content of character is nothing when compared to the colour of someone's skin. Such a sentiment seemed to be echoed by many on social media during the debate that erupted after a white man disagreed with a woman of mixed heritage live on BBC One, a woman of mixed heritage who in turn found his perspective to be problematic on the basis that he was a white privileged male. Both subsequently experienced abuse on Twitter, and the white man was even publicly denounced by someone acting on behalf of a trade union. And significantly, both also received criticism for evoking the words and memory of Martin Luther King. At least one person pointed out the irony of the woman of mixed heritage having MLK as her banner image, while another even went as far as proposing that she had appropriated his spirits for hateful intent. But this was nothing compared to the scale of criticism and abuse the white man experienced after expressing solidarity with the Reverend King's perspective on character and skin, including from none less than Doctor Who herself, Jo Martin, who would be unveiled as the by then 56-year-old character the following week. Martin retweeted this tweet from Danny Lee Winter, the founder of the Act for Change project, the campaign for greater diversity in the live and recorded arts. And unless you want to entertain the retweets are not necessarily an endorsement game, then I think it's fair to say that Doctor Who thinks that Lawrence Fox is a stupid, arrogant, entitled cunt. Which obviously is fair enough as far as it's fair enough, because as the man from the trade union eventually conceded, everybody is still entitled to their opinion. However, especially in the context of MLK's words, in my humble subjective opinion, it's not necessarily the best example to be setting for young fans.
Oops.
It is different, yeah, it's a different morality. Get used to it or go home.
This is a death of intelligence. This is a death of intelligence.
The delight for me was I wrote the audition scenes, which Jodie came in and did, and she brought that doctor to the audition, and it was like there. And then I'm just writing for that doctor from that moment on.
Patrick Troughton's my favourite doctor, actually. Yeah. He's brilliant. I just think he has that really mad, peculiar face, and he's always really peculiar without ever trying to be peculiar, you know. This is a gift of intelligence.